3. Interrogation and intuition. Philosophy does not raise questions and does not provide answers that would, little by little, fill in the blanks. The questions are within our life, within our history. They are born there, they die there. If they have found a response, more often than not, they are transformed there. In any case, it is a past of experience and of knowledge that one day ends up at this open wondering. Philosophy does not take the context as given, it turns back upon it in order to seek the origin and the meaning of the questions, and of the responses and the identity of him who questions, and it thereby gains access to the interrogation that animates all the questions of cognition, but is of another sort than they. Our ordinary questions, where am I, what time is it, are the lack and the provisional absence of a fact or of a positive statement, holes in a fabric of things or of indicatives that we are sure is continuous, since there is a time, a space, and since the only question is at what point of this space and of this time we are. Philosophy, at first sight, only generalizes this type of question. When it asks if space, if time, if movement, if the world exist, the field of the question is more ample. But like the natural question, it is still but a semi-question, included within a fundamental faith. There is something, and the only question is if it is really this space, this time, this movement, this world that we think we see or feel. The destruction of beliefs, the symbolic murder of the others and of the world, the split between vision and the visible, between thought and being, do not, as they claim, establish us in the negative. When one has subtracted all that, one installs oneself in what remains, in sensations, opinions. And what remains is not nothing, nor of another sort than what has been struck off. What remains are mutilated fragments of the vague omnitudo realitatis against which the doubt was plied, and they regenerate it under other names: appearance, dream, psyche, representation. It is in the name and for the profit of these floating realities that the solid reality is cast into doubt. One does not quit the something, and doubt as a destruction of certitudes is not a doubt. It is no different when the doubt is made methodic, when it is no longer a fluidification of the certitudes, but a deliberate withdrawal, a refusal to embody them. This time one no longer contests that there are evidences and that for the moment they are irresistible. And if one holds them in suspense, it is for the sole motive that they are our own, caught up in the flux of our life, and that in order to retain them more than an instant, we should have to trust in the obscure time equipment of our internal works, which perhaps gives us only coherent illusions. This deceiving nature, this opaque something that would shut us up in our lights, is only a phantasm of our rigorism, a perhaps. If this possible suffices to hold in check our evidences, it is because we give weight to it by the decision to tacitly presuppose nothing. If, in its name, we feign to nullify lights we could not nullify really, take what is only conditional to be false, make of an eventual divergence between the evident and the true an infinite distance, and of a speculative doubt the equivalent of a condemnation, it is because, as passive beings, we feel ourselves caught up in a mass of being that escapes us, or even maneuvered by an evil agent. And we oppose to this adversity the desire for an absolute evidence, delivered from all facticity. Thus, the methodic doubt, that which is carried out within the voluntary zone of ourselves, refers to being, since it resists a factual evidence, represses an involuntary truth, which it acknowledges to be already there, and which inspires the very project of seeking an evidence that would be absolute. If it remains a doubt, it can do so only by reviving the equivocations of skepticism, by omitting to mention the borrowings it makes from being, or by evoking a falsity of being itself. A great deceiver, a being that actively conceals itself and pushes before itself the screen of our thought and of its evidences, as if this elusive being were nothing. The philosophical interrogation, therefore, would not go all the way through with itself if it limited itself to generalizing the doubt, the common question of an an sit, to extending them to the world or to being, and would define itself as doubt, non-knowing, or non-belief. Things are not so simple. In being extended to everything, the common question changes its meaning. Philosophy elects certain beings, sensations, representation, thought, consciousness, or even a deceiving being, in order to separate itself from all being. Precisely in order to accomplish its will for radicalism, it would have to take as its theme the umbilical bond that binds it always to being, the inalienable horizon with which it is already and henceforth circumvented, the primary initiation, which it tries in vain to go back on. It would have to no longer deny, no longer even doubt. It would have to step back only in order to see the world and being, or simply put them between quotation marks, as one does with the remarks of another, to let them speak, to listen in. Then, if the question can no longer be that of an an sit, it becomes that of the quid sit. There remains only to study what the world and truth and being are in terms of the complicity that we have with them. At the same time that the doubt is renounced, one renounces the affirmation of an absolute exterior, of a world or a being that would be a massive individual. One turns towards that being that doubles our thoughts along their whole extension, since they are thoughts of something, and since they themselves are not nothing. A being, therefore, that is meaning, and meaning of meaning. Not only that meaning that is attached to words and belongs to the order of statements and of things said, to a circumscribed region of the world, to a certain type of being, but universal meaning, which would be capable of sustaining logical operations and language, and the unfolding of the world as well. It will be that without which there would be neither world nor language nor anything at all. It will be the essence. When it looks back from the world to what makes it a world, from beings to what makes them be, the pure gaze, which involves nothing implicit, which does not, like the gaze of our eyes, have the darkness of a body and a past behind itself, could apply itself only to something that would be before it without restriction or condition, to what makes the world be a world, to an imperative grammar of being, to indecomposable nuclei of meaning, systems of inseparable properties. The essences are this intrinsic sense, these necessities by principle. However may be the realities in which they are compounded and confused, but where their implications constantly make themselves no less felt, they are the sole legitimate or authentic being, which has the pretension and the right to be, and which is affirmative of itself, because it is the system of everything that is possible before the eyes of a pure spectator, the diagram or pattern of what, at all the levels, is something in general, or something material, or something spiritual, or something living. Through the question quid sit, more effectively than through the doubt, philosophy succeeds in detaching itself from all beings because it changes them into their meaning. This is already the procedure of science, when, to respond to the questions of life, which are only a hesitation between the yes and the no, it casts the prevailing categories into question, invents new types of being, a new heaven of essences. But it does not terminate this labor. It does not entirely disengage its essences from the world. It maintains them under the jurisdiction of the facts, which can tomorrow call for another elaboration. Galileo gives but a rough draft of the material thing, and the whole of classical physics lives on an essence of physis that is perhaps not the true essence. Must one maintain its principles, and by means of some auxiliary hypothesis, reduce wave mechanics to them, however one can? Or, on the contrary, are we in sight of a new essence of the material world? Must we maintain the Marxist essence of history and treat the facts that seem to call it into question as empirical and confused variants? Or, on the contrary, are we at a turning point where, beneath the Marxist essence of history, a more authentic and more complete essence shows through? The question remains unsettled in scientific knowing because in it truths of facts and truths of reason overlap, and because the carving out of the facts, like the elaboration of the essences, is there conducted under presuppositions that remain to be interrogated, if we are to know fully what science means. Philosophy would be this same reading of meaning carried out to its conclusion, an exact science, the sole exact one, because it alone goes all the way in the effort to know what nature and history and the world and being are, when our contact with them is not only the partial and abstract contact of the physical experiment and calculation, or of the historical analysis, but the total contact of someone who, living in the world and in being, means to see his life fully, particularly his life of knowledge, and who, an inhabitant of the world, tries to think himself in the world, to think the world in himself, to unravel their jumbled essences, and to form, finally, the signification being. When philosophy finds beneath the doubt a prior knowing, finds around the things and the world as facts, and as doubtful facts, a horizon that encompasses our negations as our affirmations, and when it penetrates into this horizon, certainly it must define anew this new something. Does it define it well or sufficiently by saying that it is the essence? Is the question of the essence the ultimate question? With the essence and the pure spectator who sees it, are we really at the source? The essence is certainly dependent. The inventory of the essential necessities is always made under a supposition, the same as that which recurs so often in Kant. If this world is to exist for us, or if there is to be a world, or if there is to be something, then it is necessary that they observe such and such a structural law. But whence do we get the hypothesis? Whence do we know that there is something, that there is a world? This knowing is beneath the essence. It is the experience of which the essence is a part, and which it does not envelop. The being of the essence is not primary. It does not rest on itself. It is not it that can teach us what being is. The essence is not the answer to the philosophical question. The philosophical question is not posed in us by a pure spectator. It is first a question as to how, upon what ground, the pure spectator is established, from what more profound source he himself draws. Without the necessities by essence, the unshakable connections, the irresistible implications, the resistant and stable structures, there would be neither a world, nor something in general, nor being. But their authority as essences, their affirmative power, their dignity as principles, are not self-evident. We do not have the right to say that the essences we find give the primitive meaning of being, that they are the possible in itself, the whole possible, and to repute as impossible all that does not obey their laws, not to treat being and the world as their consequence. They are only its manner or its style. They are the so-sign and not the sign. And if we are justified in saying that every thought respects them as well as does our own, if they have universal value, this is so inasmuch as another thought founded on other principles must, if it is to make itself known to us, to enter into communication with us, adapt itself to the conditions of our own thought, of our experience, take its place in our world, and inasmuch as, finally, all the thinkers and all the essences possible open upon one sole experience and upon the same world. We are no doubt using essences in order to establish and state this. The necessity of this conclusion is a necessity of essence. But it only crosses over the limits of one thought and imposes itself upon all. It indeed only survives my own intuition of the moment, and is valid for me as a durable truth, because my own experience interconnects within itself and connects with that of the others by opening upon one sole world, by inscribing itself in one sole being. It is to experience, therefore, that the ultimate ontological power belongs, and the essences, the necessities by essence, the internal or logical possibility, solid and incontestable, as they may be under the gaze of the mind, have finally their force and their eloquence, only because all my thoughts and the thoughts of the others are caught up in the fabric of one sole being. The pure spectator in me, which elevates each thing to the essence, which produces its ideas, is assured that it touches being with them only because it emerges within an actual experience surrounded by actual experiences, by the actual world, by the actual being, which is the ground of the predicative being. The possibilities by essence can indeed envelop and dominate the facts. They themselves derive from another and more fundamental possibility, that which works over my experience, opens it to the world and to being, and which, to be sure, does not find them before itself as facts, but animates and organizes their facticity. When philosophy ceases to be doubt in order to make itself disclosure, explication, the field it opens to itself is indeed made up of significations or of essences, since it has detached itself from the facts and the beings. But these significations or essences do not suffice to themselves. They overtly refer to our acts of ideation, which have lifted them from a brute being, wherein we must find again, in their wild state, what answers to our essences and our significations. When I ask myself what the something or the world or the material thing is, I am not yet the pure spectator I will become through the act of ideation. I am a field of experience where there is only sketched out the family of material things and other families, and the world as their common style, the family of things said and the world of speech as their common style, and finally the abstract and fleshless style of something in general. In order to pass from this to the essences, it is necessary for me to actively intervene, to vary the things and the field, not through some manipulation, but without touching them, by supposing changes or putting out of circuit such and such a relationship or such and such a structure, noting how this would affect the others, so as to locate those relationships and structures that are separable from the thing, and those, on the contrary, that one could not suppress or change without the thing ceasing to be itself. It is from this test that the essence emerges. It is therefore not a positive being. It is an invariant. It is exactly that whose change or absence would alter or destroy the thing, and the solidity, the essentiality of the essence is exactly measured by the power we have to vary the thing. A pure essence which would not be at all contaminated and confused with the facts could result only from an attempt at total variation. It would require a spectator himself without secrets, without latency, if we are to be certain that nothing be surreptitiously introduced into it. In order to really reduce an experience to its essence, we should have to achieve a distance from it that would put it entirely under our gaze, with all the implications of sensoriality or thought that come into play in it. Bring it and bring ourselves wholly to the transparency of the imaginary, think it without the support of any ground. In short, withdraw to the bottom of nothingness. Only then could we know what moments positively make up the being of this experience. But would this still be an experience, since I would be soaring over it? And if I tried to maintain a sort of adhesion to it in thought, is it properly speaking in essence that I would see? Every ideation, because it is an ideation, is formed in a space of existence, under the guarantee of my duration, which must turn back into itself in order to find there again the same idea I thought an instant ago, and must pass into the others in order to rejoin it, also in them. Every ideation is born by this tree of my duration and other durations. This unknown sap nourishes the transparency of the idea. Behind the idea, there is the unity, the simultaneity of all the real and possible durations, the cohesion of one sole being from one end to the other. Under the solidity of the essence and of the idea, there is the fabric of experience, this flesh of time, and this is why I am not sure of having penetrated onto the hard core of being. My incontestable power to give myself leeway, prendre du champ, to disengage the possible from the real, does not go as far as to dominate all the implications of the spectacle and to make of the real a simple variant of the possible. On the contrary, it is possible worlds and the possible beings that are variants and are like doubles of an actual world and the actual being. I have leeway enough to replace such and such moments of my experience with others, to observe that this does not suppress it, therefore to determine the inessential. But does what remains after these eliminations belong necessarily to the being in question? In order to affirm that I should have to soar over my field, suspend or at least reactivate all the sedimented thoughts with which it is surrounded. First of all, my time, my body, which is not only impossible for me to do in fact, but would deprive me of that very cohesion in depth, en épaisseur, of the world and of being, without which the essence is subjective folly and arrogance. There is therefore for me something inessential, and there is a zone, a hollow, where what is not inessential, not impossible, assembles. There is no positive vision that would definitively give me the essentiality of the essence. Shall we say then that we fall short of the essence, that we have it only in principle, that it lies at the limit of an always imperfect idealization. This double thinking that opposes the principle and the fact saves, with the term principle, only a presumption of the essence, although this is the moment to decide if it is justified. And to save the presumption, it entrenches us in relativism, although by renouncing the essence that is intemporal and without locality, we would perhaps obtain a true thought with regard to the essence. It is on account of having begun with the antithesis of the fact and the essence, of what is individuated in a point of space and time, and what is from forever and nowhere, that one is finally led to treat the essence as a limit idea, that is, to make it inaccessible. For this is what obliged us to seek the being of the essence in the form of a second positivity beyond the order of the facts, to dream of a variation of the thing that would eliminate from it all that is not authentically itself and would make it appear all naked, whereas it is always clothed, to dream of an impossible labor of experience on experience that would strip it of its facticity as if it were an impurity. Perhaps if we were to re-examine the antithesis of fact and essence, we would be able, on the contrary, to redefine the essence in a way that would give us access to it, because it would be not beyond, but at the heart of that coiling up, enroulement, of experience over experience, which a moment ago constituted the difficulty. Only a thought that looks at being from elsewhere, and as it were head-on, is forced into the bifurcation of the essence and the fact. If I am kosmotheoros, my sovereign gaze finds the things each in its own time, in its own place, as absolute individuals in a unique local and temporal disposition. Since they participate in the same significations, each from its own place, one is led to conceive another dimension that would be a transversal to this flat multiplicity, and that would be the system of significations without locality or temporality. And then, since it is indeed necessary to connect the two, and to comprehend how the two orders are connected up through us, one arrives at the inextricable problem of the intuition of essences. But am I kosmotheoros? More exactly, is being kosmotheoros my ultimate reality? Am I primitively the power to contemplate, a pure look which fixes the things in their temporal and local place, and the essences in an invisible heaven? Am I this ray of knowing that would have to arise from nowhere? But even while I am installing myself at this 0 point of being, I know very well that it has a mysterious tie with locality and temporality. Tomorrow, in a moment, this aerial view, with everything it encompasses, will fall at a certain date of the calendar. I will assign to it a certain point of apparition on the earth and in my life. One has to believe that time has continued to flow on beneath, and that the earth has continued to exist. Since, however, I had crossed over to the other side, instead of saying that I am in time and in space, or that I am nowhere, why not rather say that I am everywhere, always, by being at this moment and at this place? For the visible present is not in time and space, nor, of course, outside of them. There is nothing before it, after it, about it, that could compete with its visibility. And yet it is not alone. It is not everything. To put it precisely, it stops up my view. That is, time and space extend beyond the visible present, and at the same time they are behind it, in depth, in hiding. The visible can thus fill me and occupy me only because I who see it do not see it from the depths of nothingness, but from the midst of itself. I, the seer, am also visible. What makes the weight, the thickness, the flesh of each color, of each sound, of each tactile texture, of the present and of the world, is the fact that he who grasps them feels himself emerge from them by a sort of coiling up or redoubling, fundamentally homogeneous with them. He feels that he is the sensible itself coming to itself, and that in return the sensible is in his eyes, as it were, his double, or an extension of his own flesh. The space, the time of the things, are shreds of himself, of his own spatialization, of his own temporalization, are no longer a multiplicity of individuals synchronically and diachronically distributed, but a relief of the simultaneous and of the successive, a spatial and temporal pulp where the individuals are formed by differentiation. The things, here, there, now, then, are no longer in themselves, in their own place, in their own time. They exist only at the end of those rays of spatiality and of temporality emitted in the secrecy of my flesh. And their solidity is not that of a pure object which the mind soars over. I experience their solidity from within insofar as I am among them, and insofar as they communicate through me as a sentient thing. Like the memory screen of the psychoanalysts, the present, the visible, counts so much for me and has an absolute prestige for me only by reason of this immense latent content of the past, the future, and the elsewhere, which it announces and which it conceals. There is therefore no need to add to the multiplicity of spatio-temporal atoms a transversal dimension of essences. What there is a whole architecture, a whole complex of phenomena, in tiers, a whole series of levels of being, which are differentiated by the coiling up of the visible and the universal over a certain visible wherein it is redoubled and inscribed. Fact and essence can no longer be distinguished, not because, mixed up in our experience, they in their purity would be inaccessible and would subsist as limit ideas beyond our experience, but because, being no longer being before me, but surrounding me and in a sense traversing me, and my vision of being not forming itself from elsewhere but from the midst of being, the alleged facts, the spatio-temporal individuals, are from the first mounted on the axes, the pivots, the dimensions, the generality of my body, and the ideas are therefore already encrusted in its joints. There is no emplacement of space and time that would not be a variant of the others, as they are of it. There is no individual that would not be representative of a species or of a family of beings, would not be a certain style, a certain manner of managing the domain of space and time over which it has competency, of pronouncing, of articulating that domain, of radiating about a wholly virtual center. In short, a certain manner of being, in the active sense, a certain Wesen, in the sense that, says Heidegger, this word has when it is used as a verb. In short, there is no essence, no idea, that does not adhere to a domain of history and of geography. Not that it is confined there and inaccessible for the others, but because, like that of nature, the space or time of culture is not surveyable from above, and because the communication from one constituted culture to another occurs through the wild region wherein they all have originated. Where in all this is the essence? Where is the existence? Where is the so-sign? Where the sign? We never have before us pure individuals, indivisible glaciers of beings, nor essences without place and without date. Not that they exist elsewhere beyond our grasp, but because we are experiences, that is, thoughts that feel behind themselves the weight of the space, the time, the very being they think, and which therefore do not hold under their gaze a serial space and time, nor the pure idea of series, but have about themselves a time and a space that exists by piling up, by proliferation, by encroachment, by promiscuity. A perpetual pregnancy, perpetual parturition, generativity and generality, brute essence and brute existence, which are the nodes and antinodes of the same ontological vibration. And if one were to ask what is this indecisive milieu in which we find ourselves once the distinction between fact and essence is rejected, one must answer that it is the very sphere of our life and of our life of knowledge. Now would be the time to reject the myths of inductivity and of the Wessenschau, which are transmitted as points of honor from generation to generation. It is nonetheless clear that Husserl himself never obtained one sole Wessenschau that he did not subsequently take up again and rework, not to disown it, but in order to make it say what at first it had not quite said. Thus it would be naive to seek solidity in a heaven of ideas or in a ground, fond, of meaning. It is neither above nor beneath the appearances, but at their joints. It is the tie that secretly connects an experience to its variance. It is clear also that pure inductivity is a myth. let us set aside the domain of physics to show later that the psychoanalysis of objective knowledge is interminable, or rather that, like every psychoanalysis, it is destined not to suppress the past, the phantasms, but to transform them from powers of death into poetic productivity, and that the very idea of objective knowledge and the idea of algorithm as a spiritual automaton, and finally the idea of an object that informs itself and knows itself, are, as much as any other ideas, and more than any other, supported by our reveries. Let us leave that aside for the moment. In any case, as soon as it is a question of the living being and of the body, and a fortiori of man, it is indeed clear that no fruitful research is pure inductivity, a pure inventorying of constants in themselves, that psychology, ethnology, sociology have taught us something only by putting the morbid or archaic or simply different experience in contact with our experience, by clarifying the one by the other, criticizing the one by the other, by organizing the ineinander, and finally, by practicing that eidetic variation which Husserl was wrong to reserve primarily for the solitary imagination and vision of the philosopher, whereas it is the support and the very locus of that opinio communis we call science. Along this route, at least, it is indeed certain that we gain access to objectivity, not by penetrating into an in itself, but by disclosing, rectifying each by the other, the exterior datum and the internal double of it that we possess insofar as we are sensible sentients, sont-on sensible, archetypes and variants of humanity and of life, that is, insofar as we are within life, within the human being and within being, and insofar as it is in us as well, and insofar as we live and know not halfway between opaque facts and limpid ideas, but at the point of intersection and overlapping where families of facts inscribe their generality, their kinship, group themselves about the dimensions and the site of our own existence. This environment of brute existence and essence is not something mysterious. We never quit it. We have no other environment. The facts and the essences are abstractions. What there is are worlds, and a world, and a being, not a sum of facts or a system of ideas, but the impossibility of meaninglessness, or ontological void, since space and time are not the sum of local and temporal individuals, but the presence and latency behind each of all the others, and behind those of still others. And what they are we do not know, but we do know at least that they are determinable in principle. This world, this being, facticity and ideality undividedly, is not one in the sense that being one applies to the individuals it contains, and still less is it two or several in that sense. Yet it is nothing mysterious. It is, whatever we may say, this world, this being that our life, our science, and our philosophy inhabit. We shall render explicit the cohesion of time, of space and time, the simultaneity of their parts, literal simultaneity in space, simultaneity in the figurative sense in time, and the intertwining, entrelac, of space and time. And we shall render explicit the cohesion of the obverse and the reverse of my body, which is responsible for the fact that my body, which is visible, tangible like a thing, acquires this view upon itself, this contact with itself, where it doubles itself up, unifies itself, in such a way that the objective body and the phenomenal body turn about one another or encroach upon one another. For the moment it suffices to show that the unique being, the dimensionality to which these moments, these leaves, and these dimensions belong, is beyond the classical essence and existence, and renders their relationship comprehensible. Before the essence as before the fact, all we must do is situate ourselves within the being we are dealing with, instead of looking at it from the outside. Or, what amounts to the same thing, what we have to do is put it back into the fabric of our life, attend from within to the dehiscence, analogous to that of my own body, which opens it to itself and opens us upon it, and which, in the case of the essence, is the dehiscence of the speaking and the thinking. As my body, which is one of the visibles, sees itself also, and thereby makes itself the natural light, opening its own interior to the visible, in order for the visible there to become my own landscape, realizing, as it is said, the miraculous promotion of being to consciousness, or, as we prefer to say, the segregation of the within and the without, so also speech, la parole, which is sustained by the thousands of ideal relations of the particular language, la langue, and which, therefore, in the eyes of science, is, as a constituted language, langage, a certain region in the universe of significations, is also the organ and the resonator of all the other regions of signification, and consequently coextensive with the thinkable. Like the flesh of the visible, speech is a total part of the significations. Like it, speech is a relation to being through a being. And, like it is narcissistic, eroticized, endowed with a natural magic that attracts the other significations into its web, as the body feels the world in feeling itself. In reality, there is much more than a parallel or an analogy here. There is solidarity and intertwining. If speech, which is but a region of the intelligible world, can also be its refuge, this is because speech prolongs into the invisible, extends unto the semantic operations, the belongingness of the body to being, and the corporeal relevance of every being, which for me is once and for all attested by the visible, and whose idea each intellectual evidence reflects a little further. In a philosophy that takes into consideration the operative world, functioning, present and coherent, as it is, the essence is not at all a stumbling block. It has its place there as an operative, functioning essence. No longer are there essences above us, like positive objects offered to a spiritual eye, but there is an essence beneath us, a common nervure of the signifying and the signified, adherence in and reversibility of one another. As the visible things are the secret folds of our flesh, and yet our body is one of the visible things. As the world is behind my body, the operative essence is behind the operative speech also, the speech that possesses the signification less than it is possessed by it, that does not speak of it, but speaks it, or speaks according to it, or lets it speak and be spoken within me, breaks through my present. If there is an ideality, a thought that has a future in me, that even breaks through my space of consciousness and has a future with the others, and finally, having become a writing, has a future in every possible reader, this can be only that thought that leaves me with my hunger and leaves them with their hunger, that betokens a generalized buckling of my landscape and opens it to the universal, precisely because it is rather an unthought. Ideas that are too much possessed are no longer ideas. I no longer think anything when I speak of them, as if it were essential to the essence that it be for tomorrow, as if it were only a tacking thread in the fabric of the words. A discussion is not an exchange or a confrontation of ideas, as if each formed his own, showed them to the others, looked at theirs, and returned to correct them with his own. Someone speaks, and immediately the others are now but certain divergencies by relation to his words, and he himself specifies his divergence in relation to them. Whether he speaks up or hardly whispers, each one speaks with all that he is, with his ideas, but also with his obsessions, his secret history, which the others suddenly lay before by formulating them as ideas. Life becomes ideas, and the ideas return to life. Each is caught up in the vortex in which he first committed only measured stakes. Each is led on by what he said, and the response he received, led on by his own thought of which he is no longer the sole thinker. No one thinks anymore. Everyone speaks. All live and gesticulate within being as I stir within my landscape, guided by gradients of differences to be observed or to be reduced, if I wish to remain here or to go yonder. Whether in discussion or in monologue, the essence in the living and active state is always a certain vanishing point, indicated by the arrangement of the words, their other side, inaccessible save for him who accepts to live first and always in them. As the nervure bears the leaf from within, from the depths of its flesh, the ideas are the texture of experience, its style, first mute, then uttered. Like every style, they are elaborated within the thickness of being, and, not only in fact but also by right, could not be detached from it, to be spread out on display under the gaze. The philosophical interrogation is therefore not the simple expectation of a signification that would come to fill it. What is the world? Or better, what is being? These questions become philosophical only if, by a sort of diplopia, at the same time that they aim at a state of things, they aim at themselves as questions. At the same time that they aim at the signification being, they aim at the being of signification and the place of signification within being. It is characteristic of the philosophical questioning that it return upon itself, that it ask itself also what to question is and what to respond is. Once this question to the second power is raised, it cannot be effaced. Henceforth, nothing can continue to be as if there had never been any question. The forgetting of the question, the return to the positive, would be possible only if the questioning were a simple absence of meaning, a withdrawal into the nothingness that is nothing. But he who questions is not nothing. He is, and this is something quite different, a being that questions himself. The negative in him is born by an infrastructure of being. It is, therefore, not a nothing that eliminates itself from the account. We said that the doubt is a clandestine positivism, and that it is necessary to go beyond it toward the something it negates and yet affirms. But conversely, if we wish to go beyond it unto a sphere of absolute certitude, that would be the sphere of significations or essences, this absolute positivism would mean that he who questions had distanced being and the world from himself so much that he was one of them no longer. Like the negativism of the doubt, the positivism of the essences says secretly the contrary of what it says openly. The intent to reach the absolutely hard being of the essence conceals the mendacious pretension to be nothing. No question goes toward being. If only by virtue of its being as a question, it has already frequented being. It is returning to it. As the view that the question be a real rupture with being, a lived nothingness, is precluded, also precluded is the view that it be an ideal rupture, an absolutely pure gaze directed upon an experience reduced to its signification or its essence. As is precluded the view that the question be without response, be a pure gaping toward a transcendent being, also precluded is the view that the response be immanent to the question, and that, as Marx said, humanity raise only the questions it can resolve. And these two types are precluded for the same reason, which is that in both hypotheses there would finally be no question, and that in both these views our initial situation is ignored, either cut off from being. We would not even have enough of the positive to raise a question, or, already caught up in being, we would be already beyond every question. The questions of essence to which one wishes to reduce philosophy are not of themselves more philosophical than the questions of fact, and the questions of fact, when the occasion arises, no less philosophical than they. The dimension of philosophy cuts across that of the essence and the fact. To question oneself about the essence of time and of space is not yet to do philosophy. If one does not, then question oneself about the relations of time itself and of space itself with their essence. And in a sense, the questions of fact go further than the truths of reason. From time to time, a man lifts his head, sniffs, listens, considers, recognizes his position. He thinks, he sighs, and, drawing his watch from the pocket lodged against his chest, looks at the time. Where am I, and what time is it? Such is the inexhaustible question turning from us to the world. Note: Claudel, Art Poétique, Paris, 1951. Editor: the reader will notice that the same passage from Claudel has already been cited and commented on. The repetition is evidence of the unfinished state of the manuscript. End note. Inexhaustible, because the time and the place change continually, but especially because the question that arises here is not at bottom a question of knowing in what spot of a space taken as given, at what hour of a time taken as given, we are. But first, what is this indestructible tie between us and hours and places, this perpetual taking of our bearings on the things, this continual installation among them, through which first it is necessary that I be at a time, at a place, whatever they be? positive information, a statement, whatever it be, only defer that question and beguile our hunger. They refer us to some sort of law of our being that lays down that after a space there is a space, that after a time there is a time. But it is this law itself that our questions of fact are reaching for. If we could scrutinize their ultimate motivation, we would find beneath the questions, where am I and what time is it, a secret knowledge of space and time as beings to be questioned, a secret knowledge of interrogation as the ultimate relation to being, and as an ontological organ. The necessities by essence will not be the answer philosophy calls for any more than are the facts. The answer is higher than the facts, lower than the essences, in the wild being where they were, and, behind or beneath the cleavages of our acquired culture, continue to be, undivided. What we propose here, and oppose to the search for the essence, is not the return to the immediate, the coincidence, the effective fusion with the existent, the search for an original integrity, for a secret lost and to be rediscovered, which would nullify our questions and even reprehend our language. If coincidence is lost, this is no accident. If being is hidden, this is itself a characteristic of being, and no disclosure will make us comprehend it. A lost immediate, arduous to restore, will, if we do restore it, bear within itself the sediment of the critical procedures through which we will have found it anew. It will therefore not be the immediate. If it is to be the immediate, if it is to retain no trace of the operations through which we approach it, if it is being itself, this means that there is no route from us to it, and that it is inaccessible by principle. The visible things about us rest in themselves, and their natural being is so full that it seems to envelop their perceived being, as if our perception of them were formed within them. But if I express this experience by saying that the things are in their place and that we fuse with them, I immediately make the experience itself impossible. For in the measure that the thing is approached, I cease to be. In the measure that I am, there is no thing, but only a double of it in my camera obscura. The moment my perception is to become pure perception, thing, being, it is extinguished. The moment it lights up, already I am no longer the thing. And likewise, there is no real coinciding with the being of the past. If the pure memory is the former, present, preserved, and if, in the act of recalling, I really become again what I was, it becomes impossible to see how it could open to me the dimension of the past. And if, in being inscribed within me, each present loses its flesh, if the pure memory into which it is changed is an invisible, then there is indeed a past, but no coinciding with it. I am separated from it by the whole thickness of my present. It is mine only by finding in some way a place in my present, in making itself present anew. As we never have at the same time the thing and the consciousness of the thing, we never have at the same time the past and the consciousness of the past, and for the same reason. In an intuition by coincidence and fusion, everything one gives to being is taken from experience. Everything one gives to experience is taken from being. The truth of the matter is that the experience of a coincidence can be, as Bergson often says, only a partial coincidence. But what is a coincidence that is only partial? It is a coincidence always past or always future. An experience that remembers an impossible past, anticipates an impossible future, that emerges from being or that will incorporate itself into being. That is of it, but is not it, and therefore is not a coincidence, a real fusion, as of two positive terms or two elements of an alloyage, but an overlaying, as of a hollow and a relief which remain distinct. Coming after the world, after nature, after life, after thought, and finding them constituted before it, philosophy indeed questions this antecedent being, and questions itself concerning its own relationship with it. It is a return upon itself and upon all things, but not a return to an immediate, which recedes in the measure that philosophy wishes to approach it and fuse into it. The immediate is at the horizon, and must be thought as such. It is only by remaining at a distance that it remains itself. There is an experience of the visible thing as pre-existing my vision, but this experience is not a fusion, a coincidence. Because my eyes, which see, my hands, which touch, can also be seen and touched, because, therefore, in this sense they see and touch the visible, the tangible, from within, because our flesh lines and even envelops all the visible and tangible things with which nevertheless it is surrounded, the world and I are within one another. And there is no anteriority of the percipere to the percipi. There is simultaneity, or even retardation. For the weight of the natural world is already a weight of the past. Each landscape of my life, because it is not a wandering troop of sensations or a system of ephemeral judgments, but a segment of the durable flesh of the world, is qua visible, pregnant with many other visions besides my own. And the visible that I see, of which I speak, even if it is not Mount Hymettus or the plane trees of Delphi, is numerically the same that Plato and Aristotle saw and spoke of. When I find again the actual world such as it is, under my hands, under my eyes, up against my body, I find much more than an object. A being of which my vision is a part, a visibility older than my operations or my acts. But this does not mean that there was a fusion or coinciding of me with it. On the contrary, this occurs because a sort of dehiscence opens my body in two, and because between my body looked at and my body looking, my body touched and my body touching, there is overlapping or encroachment, so that we must say that the things pass into us as well as we into the things. Our intuition, said Bergson, is a reflection, and he was right. His intuition shares with the philosophies of reflection a sort of supralapsarian bias. The secret of being is an integrity that is behind us. Like the philosophies of reflection, what Bergson lacks is the double reference, the identity of the retiring into oneself and the leaving of oneself, of the lived through with the distance. The return to the immediate data, the deepening of experience on the spot, are certainly the hallmark of philosophy by opposition to naive cognitions. But the past and the present, the essence and the fact, space and time, are not given in the same sense, and none of them is given in the sense of coincidence. The originating is not of one sole type. It is not all behind us. The restoration of the true past, of the pre-existence, is not all of philosophy. The lived experience is not flat, without depth, without dimension. It is not an opaque stratum with which we would have to merge. The appeal to the originating goes in several directions. The originating breaks up, and philosophy must accompany this breakup, this non-coincidence, this differentiation. The difficulties of coincidence are not only factual difficulties, which would leave the principle intact. Already with respect to the intuition of essences, we have encountered this system of double truth, which is also a system of double falsity. For what is true in principle, never being true in fact, and conversely the factual situation never committing the principles, each of the two instances condemns the other, and condemns it with reprieve, by leaving to it competency in its own order. If the coincidence is never but partial, we must not define the truth by total or effective coincidence. And if we have the idea of the thing itself and of the past itself, there must be something in the factual order that answers to it. It is therefore necessary that the deflection, écart, without which the experience of the thing or of the past would fall to zero, be also an openness upon the thing itself, to the past itself, that it enter into their definition. What is given, then, is not the naked thing, the past itself such as it was in its own time, but rather the thing ready to be seen, pregnant, in principle as well as in fact, with all the visions one can have of it. The past such as it was one day, plus an inexplicable alteration, a strange distance, bound in principle as well as in fact, to a recalling that spans that distance but does not nullify it. What there is not a coinciding by principle or a presumptive coinciding and a factual non-coinciding, a bad or abortive truth, but a privative non-coinciding, a coinciding from afar, a divergence, and something like a good error. It is by considering language that we would best see how we are to, and how we are not to, return to the things themselves. If we dream of finding again the natural world or time through coincidence, of being identical to the O point which we see yonder, or to the pure memory which from the depths of ourselves governs our acts of recall, then language is a power for error, since it cuts the continuous tissue that joins us vitally to the things and to the past, and is installed between ourselves and that tissue like a screen. The philosopher speaks, but this is a weakness in him, and an inexplicable weakness. He should keep silent, coincide in silence, and rejoin in being a philosophy that is there ready-made. But yet everything comes to pass as though he wished to put into words a certain silence he hearkens to within himself. His entire work is this absurd effort. He wrote in order to state his contact with being. He did not state it, and could not state it, since it is silence. Then he recommences. One has to believe, then, that language is not simply the contrary of the truth, of coincidence, that there is or could be a language of coincidence, a manner of making the things themselves speak, and this is what he seeks. It would be a language of which he would not be the organizer, words he would not assemble, that would combine through him by virtue of a natural intertwining of their meaning, through the occult trading of the metaphor, where what counts is no longer the manifest meaning of each word and of each image, but the lateral relations, the kinships that are implicated in their transfers and their exchanges. It is indeed a language of this sort that Bergson himself required for the philosopher, but we have to recognize the consequence. If language is not necessarily deceptive, truth is not coincidence, nor mute. We need only take language, too, in the living or nascent state, with all its references, those behind it, which connect it to the mute things it interpolates, and those it sends before itself, and which make up the world of things said, with its movement, its subtleties, its reversals, its life, which expresses and multiplies tenfold the life of the bare things. Language is a life, is our life, and the life of the things. Not that language takes possession of life and reserves it for itself. What would there be to say if there existed nothing but things said? It is the error of the semantic philosophies to close up language as if it spoke only of itself. Language lives only from silence. Everything we cast to the others has germinated in this great mute land where we never leave. But because he has experienced within himself the need to speak, the birth of speech as bubbling up at the bottom of his mute experience, the philosopher knows better than anyone that what is lived spoken, that, born at this depth, language is not a mask over being, but, if one knows how to grasp it with all its roots and all its foliation, the most valuable witness to being, that it does not interrupt an immediation that would be perfect without it, that the vision itself, the thought itself are, as has been said, structured as a language, are articulation before the letter, apparition of something where there was nothing, or something else. Hence the problem of language is, if one likes, only a regional problem. That is, if we consider the ready-made language, the secondary and empirical operation of translation, of coding and decoding, the artificial languages, the technical relation between a sound and a meaning, which are joined only by express convention and are therefore ideally isolable. But if, on the contrary, we consider the speaking word, the assuming of the conventions of his native language as something natural by him who lives within that language, the folding over within him of the visible and the lived experience upon language, and of language upon the visible and the lived experience, the exchanges between the articulations of his mute language and those of his speech, finally that operative language which has no need to be translated into significations and thoughts, that language thing which counts as an arm and action, as offense and a seduction, because it brings to the surface all the deep-rooted relations of the lived experience wherein it takes form, and which is the language of life and of action, but also that of literature and of poetry, then this logos is an absolutely universal theme. It is the theme of philosophy. Philosophy itself is language, rests on language, but this does not disqualify it from speaking of language, nor from speaking of the pre-language and of the mute world which doubles them. On the contrary, philosophy is an operative language, that language that can be known only from within, through its exercise, is open upon the things, called forth by the voices of silence, and continues an effort of articulation, which is the being of every being. We would err as much by defining philosophy as the search for the essences as by defining it as the fusion with the things. And the two errors are not so different. Whether we orientate ourselves upon the essences, which are the more pure in the measure that he who sees them has no part in the world, in the measure, consequently, that we look out from the depths of nothingness, or whether we seek to merge with the existing things, at the very point and at the very instant that they are, this infinite distance, this absolute proximity, express in two ways, as a soaring over, or as fusion, the same relationship with the thing itself. They are two positivisms. Whether one installs oneself at the level of statements, which are the proper order of the essences, or in the silence of the things, whether one trusts in speech absolutely, or whether one distrusts it absolutely. The ignorance of the problem of speech is here the ignoring of all mediation. Philosophy is flattened to the sole plane of ideality, or to the sole plane of existence. On both sides one wants something, internal adequation of the idea or self-identity of the thing, to come stop up the look, and one excludes or subordinates the thought of the far-offs, the horizontal thought. That every being presents itself at a distance, which does not prevent us from knowing it, which is on the contrary the guarantee for knowing it. This is what is not considered. That the presence of the world is precisely the presence of its flesh and my flesh, that I am of the world, and that I am not it. This is what is no sooner said than forgotten. Metaphysics remains coincidence. That there is this thickness of flesh between us and the hard core of being, this does not figure in the definition. This thickness is ascribed to me. It is the sheath of non-being that the subjectivity always carries about itself. Infinite distance or absolute proximity, negation or identification, our relationship with being is ignored in the same way in both cases. In both cases, one misses it because one thinks one will ensure it more effectively by approaching the essence or the thing as closely as possible. One forgets that this frontal being before us, whether we posit it, whether it posits itself within us qua being posited, is second by principle, is cut out upon a horizon which is not nothing, and which, for its part, is not by virtue of composition. One forgets that our openness, our fundamental relationship with being, that which makes it impossible for us to feign to not be, could not be formed in the order of the being posited, since it is this openness precisely that teaches us that the beings posited, whether true or false, are not nothing, that whatever be the experience, an experience is always contiguous upon an experience, that our perceptions, our judgments, our whole knowledge of the world can be changed, crossed out, Husserl says, but not nullified, that, under the doubt that strikes them, appear other perceptions, other judgments more true, because we are within being, and because there is something. Bergson had indeed said that the fundamental knowing is not that which wishes to take hold of time, as between forceps, wishes to fix it, to determine it by the relations between its parts, to measure it, and that on the contrary, time offers itself to him who wishes only to see it, and who, precisely because he has given up the attempt to seize it, rejoins, by vision, its internal propulsion. But more often than not, the idea of fusion or of coincidence serves as a substitute for these indications, which would call for a theory of the philosophical view or vision as a maximum of true proximity to a being in dehiscence. We should have to return to this idea of proximity through distance, of intuition as auscultation or palpitation in depth, of a view which is a view of self, a torsion of self upon self, and which calls coincidence in question. And thereby we would see finally what the philosophical questioning is, not the anceit and the doubt, where being is tacitly understood, and not the I know that I know nothing, where already the absolute certitude of the ideas breaks through, but a true what do I know, which is not quite that of Montaigne. For the what do I know could be a simple appeal for the elucidation of the things that we know, without any examination of the idea of knowing. In that case, it would be one of those questions of cognition, as can also be the where am I, where we are hesitating only about what to call entities, space, knowledge, which are taken as evident in themselves. But already when I say, what do I know, in the course of a phrase, another sort of question arises, for it extends to the idea of knowing itself. It invokes some intelligible place where the facts, examples, ideas I lack should be found. It intimates that the interrogative is not a mode derived by inversion or by reversal of the indicative and of the positive, is neither an affirmation nor a negation, veiled or expected, but an original manner of aiming at something, as it were, a question knowing, which by principle no statement or answer can go beyond, and which perhaps therefore is the proper mode of our relationship with being, as though it were the mute or reticent interlocutor of our questions. What do I know is not only what is knowing, and not only who am I, but finally, what is there, and even what is the there is. These questions call not for the exhibiting of something said which would put an end to them, but for the disclosure of a being that is not posited because it has no need to be, because it is silently behind all our affirmations, negations, and even behind all formulated questions. Not that it is a matter of forgetting them in its silence, not that it is a matter of imprisoning it in our chatter, but because philosophy is the reconversion of silence and speech into one another. It is the experience, still mute, which we are concerned with leading to the pure expression of its own meaning. Husserl, Cartesian Meditations.